Hey, journeyers, it's Irene, and today I'm really excited to have Hannah on the show today. Hannah Wastyk is a Stanford PhD candidate and fermented foods researcher who's going to be sharing a little bit more about what are fermented foods, why are people so obsessed about them, and why they might be good for you. So, I personally really enjoy eating fermented foods, but I don't necessarily know enough about the science behind it all. But I'm interested in how it relates to people's health and your own diet. So I'm excited to bring someone knowledgeable about the space and share a little bit more about microbiomes and tasty foods. So to start off, Hannah, do you mind sharing a little bit more about yourself and how you got interested in fermented foods?
Sure. So hi, everyone. As Irene said, my name is Hannah Wastyk. Thanks so much, Irene, for having me on the show. I'm excited to be here. Yeah, I'm a PhD student in Justin Sonnenberg's lab at Stanford. I study specifically how the human microbiome affects our health, specifically looking at inflammation, lowering chronic inflammation and just health in general, um, in the different aspects of how the microbiome affects us. So other than that, I'm a data analyst and in wet lab, so kind of a hybrid in terms of researchers.
Cool, awesome. And how did you get interested in fermented foods in the first place, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so I think I would be a huge diet skeptic before coming into Stanford and the particular lab. So I knew I wanted to come to grad school and understand how the microbiome and the immune system interact with each other. They're two pretty nebulous fields, but the intersection between the two is really going to be, I think, the future of where therapeutics and human physiology, our understanding of human physiology comes from. So I came into Stanford knowing I wanted to understand that, and there was a lab that was studying it with the specific gaze of diet. And so studying how those two systems interact, um, looking at it causally, what is actually changing, um, comes through diet because the microbiome is so plastic and we're able to influence it very easily. So by changing someone's diet, you change their microbiome and then you can change their immune system. So that's the idea. And so one of the studies that was going on when I started working in the lab was a high fiber and a high fermented foods diet. And that's how I got started with fermented foods. I was looking at this data that showed really incredible results that fermented foods were decreasing people's inflammation. So, we want decreased inflammation in a number of different ways. Crohn's disease, IBD, all have really high inflammation. Allergies also. So stuff like that is just really high levels of, our immune cells just signaling. And if we can decrease that, that'll also decrease the number of diseases that are pretty prevalent in the Western world right now. So that's how I got started with fermented foods because there is such compelling evidence that we could make a big change in our health.
Awesome. Yeah. And what exactly are fermented foods for people who aren't familiar, just to make sure we have like a baseline understanding for everyone?
Yeah, so I looked it up. So there's a kind of a NCBI or like a agreed upon definition of fermented foods. And then I have like a definition that's a lot less concise, but I think makes me really excited about or encapsulates why I'm so excited about fermented foods. But the official definition is foods or beverages produced through controlled microbial growth and the conversion of food components through enzymatic action. So that's a little bit jargony, but for me, like when I think about fermented foods, if I give you a glass of milk and it's sat out on the counter, room temperature for 2 to 4 days, and I told you to drink it, you'd probably not want to, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Those are potential bacteria that will give you like a really terrible stomach ache or something like that.
Exactly. Like if you smelled it, your body, biologically would say, I'm definitely not going to drink that. It's going to make me sick. But if I gave you a glass of kefir or yogurt, that's essentially milk that's been sitting out for 4 days plus. And it's okay to drink. And not only will it not get you sick, but it will actually, make you healthier and make you feel better. And so that distance between spoiled milk and kefir and yogurt is the essence of fermented food. Something happens that is not only controlled microbial growth, but beneficial microbial growth that, um, you know, pushes out the pathogens and allows the healthy microbes to flourish for us to drink is really what encapsulates what's so special about fermented foods.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a really good way to put it. Um, and what are the most popular fermented foods? I know we mentioned yogurt and kefir. I mean, people know kimchi. Are there any other fermented foods that are really popular or foods that maybe aren't popular that people might not know about?
I mean, that's a super interesting question because I think it depends on where in the world you're talking. In America, I think they're becoming a lot more trendy. Um, but in other parts of the world, like obviously Korea, kimchi is eaten at basically every meal. And in Europe, kefir is super popular. I would say the most studied is probably kefir. I'm not sure why. I think it's easy to ferment. It doesn't take super long time. Like for instance, kimchi and sauerkraut take a couple weeks generally to ferment, whereas kefir can be done within 2 to 4 days. But in the US, probably yogurt, I would say, especially with like the big boom of Greek yogurt a couple of years ago. Um, it tastes good. It's, you know, a breakfast food, whereas, sauerkraut, kimchi, those are more like savory and you have to eat them with something else. So I think, yeah, yogurt is probably the most popular, if that's it, the
Yeah,
question.
I've enjoyed sauerkraut. I enjoy eating fermented foods, and I think maybe when people think fermented foods, they'll think like soury tasting. Um, uh, and yeah, I like it. I like sauerkraut. I've had it when I was in Europe. I've had it like on, I don't know, what do they give it with sausages, I guess,
Yeah.
and mashed potatoes, I suppose. That's kind of all I
Well, I
remember
mean,
eating.
a lot of people, I get a lot of questions about like, oh, does wine count as fermented foods? Like, can I get my fermented foods quota by drinking wine or drinking beer? Obviously, the alcohol content in that is a covariate, so I'm not going to to expressly encourage people to drink more. In that respect, I mean, you can also say coffee is fermented, tea is fermented, um, sourdough bread, technically. I would say those probably have less beneficial effects than your traditional, yeah, like sauerkrauts or yogurt. My favorite is kefir. But it's interesting because kefir in America is different than the kefir they make in Europe. They they say that the kefir in America is just kind of glorified yogurt because the process is very different than how they make it in Europe, which is kefir grains. There's like these really um, I don't know how else to describe it. It just looks like a big hunk of grains and it tastes cheesier than the kefir that you can buy at Trader Joe's here in America.
Gotcha. And why exactly is like the kefir in Europe so beneficial, or why are fermented foods so beneficial for people's diets in general?
Oof, that's a tough question. I mean, I guess backing up a little bit, saying that they are beneficial, that has just very recently been shown. So there's a review in 2019 that kind of showed the gastrointestinal effects have been suggested, but haven't been proven causally. There's a paper that I was working on as part of my thesis at Stanford that is probably like the largest study looking at fermented foods and showing that um, so participants basically started at 1 to 0, and then they increased up to 6 servings a day. So you can imagine eating 6 cups of yogurt. It's quite a bit, but that's what they ate for 10 weeks, I think. And then at the end of it, they got to choose how much they ate. So it was like a choice period. But anyway, through that 10-week period of time, they increased by a lot and showed that they had decreased levels of inflammation shown by inflammatory cytokines and increased microbial diversity, which means that the number of species that was in their gut increased by a significant amount. And this is important because the amount of diversity in your gut you want it to be high because in the event that you do eat a pathogen or you have some perturbation, you'll have a lot of different microbes that will be able to take over niches as opposed to one pathogen that just takes over your entire gut and you get sick. So you have much less chance of getting sick if you have high microbial diversity in your gut. That's why it's important. So you can imagine eating fermented foods, you're eating a ton of different microbes that increases the number of things that are in your body. And this is also interesting because we found that the things that were increasing in a person's gut weren't just what they were directly consuming in the fermented food. It's actually stuff that we suspect was already in their gut and was just at such a low level that it wasn't able to flourish. And eating those fermented foods really gave it space so that a lot of different things could grow. So those are just two very quickly good things that happen when you eat fermented foods. So that kind of gets at a little bit about why they're healthy for you. The more this hasn't been proven, but conjecture, and this needs to be actually shown in a lab, but the lab I work in, what we think is that the greater the diversity of the fermented food itself, so the greater number of things that are growing in it, the microbes, the more it's going to shake up the community inside your gut.
Mm. And when these people in your study, I think that's such a fascinating study that people were eating like 6 cups of yogurt a day. In your study, were they eating just plain yogurt, like no flavor, or were they allowed to have toppings or have like other sugars in it?
So the thing with these studies is that they're very, very involved, and they're human studies, so it's going to be very variable towards the person's lifestyle and what they choose to do. And so we didn't want to control it to be, you have to eat this exact brand of yogurt so that we can, have this be a very controlled study, because that's not how people live their lives.
Mhm.
We want it to be, how do you incorporate fermented foods into your existing lifestyle so that we can have it be sustainable? And so that's kind of a pro and con, because we think that it's actually can be translated to people's lives. On the downside, it decreases experimental control. So people were eating whatever yogurt they wanted. They were eating whatever fermented foods they wanted. So a lot of people were drinking brine from sauerkraut. So instead of just eating sauerkraut, they were drinking the brine that comes off of it. People were making their own kombuchas, drinking kombuchas, all that type of thing. So when you ask like which fermented foods are the healthiest, I don't have the answer for that. We had the strongest signal with yogurt, but I think that's because people were just eating the most yogurt, but we didn't, break it down into like sugar-free, fat-free, any of those types of things. It was just like strictly number of servings. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And wow, what a talented subset of participants in your study, because these people know how to make kombucha and sauerkraut. That's like not necessarily something that I guess a regular everyday American would even know unless they're such a foodie or something like that. I did make kimchi once, but I'm like a really big foodie myself. I love like trying different foods or trying to like make stuff. I would not describe myself as a good chef. I'm just a curious person. Um, yeah, so I'm surprised at how talented the participants were.
Well, I think the interesting thing with our study as well is that the participants aren't compensated like monetarily to be in the study, and so they just have to be very interested in usually the microbiome. Well, always the microbiome, and then usually about some sort of diet. And so they're already very interested in it, and then they get free reports on like, this is what your microbiome looks like. This is how it changed over time. So they get the reports for free because they're obviously participating in the study. So that was kind of our little payback for that. But they were already very interested in it prior to the study.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious, like thinking about maybe these people having like better results after. It's like that's yeah, I mean that's so crazy that they ate so much like fermented foods like each day. It was like a daily
It was
like
a
6.
daily thing, yeah, 6 a
That's
day.
yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the big things about the study that I find the most exciting and is maybe understated in the paper that's coming out is, I mentioned that there's a choice phase. So baseline, they're eating 1 to 0, which is average for Americans. And then we told them there's a ramp phase. So they weren't just going from 1 to 6. They got to ramp up a little bit slower. So they got around 4 for a couple of weeks. And then for the maintenance, yeah, they're eating 6. And then after that, it's usually in these types of clinical-ish trials, you have a washout where you stop the intervention and see if it goes back to normal or if those changes are sustained. And so the the philosophy of the nutritionists that we work with is that we can't tell people to go back to eating unhealthy. That seems unethical. And so we changed it from a washout to a choice. And so, you can eat however many fermented foods you feel like you want to eat after these, 10 weeks that you're eating an insane amount. And the number that people were eating did decrease from 6, but they were still eating around 4 a day. And so I think that really speaks to how effective the real intervention could be. Like people still wanted to eat these foods either because they felt better or because they like them. And so it's really encouraging that it'll be a sustainable change, for longer.
And are fermented foods generally healthy if you were just to think of them as like macronutrient or micronutrients? Like, are they like, high protein or like low carb or, these other things that people generally associate with foods being healthy?
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, That's hard to say. I think for like kombucha, they have a really high sugar content. They started rolling out sugar-free kombucha. I don't think it'll be as popular because I don't think it'll be as tasty. So I mean, my gut instinct on that, and we don't have any evidence on it, is that probably the foods that are higher in sugar probably are higher in glycemic index, and so would be less healthy than, something that is lower in sugar. Um, they're not generally like super high in fat either. You can get like full fat yogurt, but I honestly don't think that that's bad for you. Um, Other things, yeah, I mean, one of the things that went increased, so we looked at the micro and macronutrients for people's diet and saw if that significantly changed, because that could be a covariate for the effects that we were seeing. And the only thing that changed in the fermented food diet was increase in animal protein. That's probably because they were eating more yogurt and so increasing their dairy intake. And so doesn't seem to change the micro macronutrient nutrient profile of a typical American diet.
Wow, that's actually really surprising. I would have thought like, oh, maybe like they're having higher protein for sure if they're eating a lot of yogurt. But I would think like, oh, maybe they're like healthier than regular. Maybe you're replacing your yogurt like simple crackers or something with your yogurt snack instead. So that could be like a good benefit. But oh,
Yeah. Well, it was a two-arm study. So the other half of the study was a high fiber diet, and that changed everything. Basically, everything they ate changed. Like the composition of everything they ate changed, because fiber fills you up a lot, and so you can
did,
imagine.
was there any weight loss associated with those
We did
type
not
of
find
things?
any weight loss. It is important to note that the participants that we studied were considered generally healthy. So that was even kind of more surprising, why maybe surprising or less surprising that we saw results, because these people were already healthy and so they were becoming more healthy. There's obviously lots of studies that we're planning, and other folks are planning as well, that look at different populations of people, like if you have diabetes and whatnot, like will that decrease your levels of inflammation and general markers of health. We're not sure. Yeah.
Oh, that's really exciting. I'd love to hear the results of those studies as well. Um, I guess in terms of an everyday person, like would an everyday person have concerns about safety around fermented foods, given that, there's like that fine line between something that's spoiled and gone bad and something that is fermented and healthy for you? Like, is there um, anything that a regular person who's not part of like a study, who wouldn't be able to like monitor their own gut microbiome on a day to day, is there any like safety concerns or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, if you're just starting out with fermented foods, I would not recommend making your own for to start off with. I would recommend just buying them off the shelf and then see how you feel. Definitely not going to help everyone. I've talked to people who they swear by it and they say that, they have um, ulcerative colitis and that kefir is the only thing that helps. I've also had people have IBD and say that they eat fermented foods and it upsets their stomach. So this is a very case by case basis. So first of all, figure out what works for you by buying off the shelf items, figure out what you enjoy eating the most. And as far as if you want to dip your toe into actually making your own fermented foods, I would say get starter cultures. So starter cultures are, the communities of fermenting microbes that you start off with. Get that from either buying online, someone who sells them, or if you have a friend that has a SCOBY for kombucha or kefir grains and they've already tried them out and drank it and they feels fine. Get that starter culture as opposed to just starting completely from scratch, because that's when I think it's um, a little bit more dicey. Fermented foods are not well regulated by the FDA. I think the only thing that really has guidelines is sauerkraut, actually, and I think that will change, especially because fermented foods are becoming so much more popular. Um, but yeah, get starter cultures from friends and do the smell test. I'm a strong proponent of if it smells dank, don't drink it because it's your body telling you that it's probably not good. Um, yeah, I think that would be the main thing. I think experimenting is exciting. Making fermented foods is really fun. If it looks like mold, probably don't drink it. Mold is not good for you. It's very different from bacteria.
Yeah, that's a good warning. Yeah, start with, just eating yogurt that you can buy at a grocery store that's maybe not expired, and that'll be relatively safe. Like, if it's in the grocery store here in America, like it's probably you'll be fine.
It's probably fine. You can also get starter culture just by buying the shelf off the shelf products. So one of the experiments in lab, we're trying to understand the science behind fermented foods more, like what determines like what community becomes stable over time and things like that. And so when we make fermented foods, we honestly just went to the store, bought some kimchi, mixed, a little bit of the kimchi with our cabbage, and then that community will overtake the microbes that are naturally on the surface of the cabbage. And we also compared that with like a wild ferment. So basically just taking the cabbage and fermenting it versus seeding it with a kimchi that we bought off the shelf. So you can also do that. Yeah, but be careful, smell tests.
Yeah, that's good. In terms of other fermented foods research, do you have any other interesting research that you worked on that you want to share about?
Hmm. Um, yeah, I think human studies are kind of been my bread and butter during my thesis. I did, yeah, the fermented foods, high fiber diet, which was interesting. We actually thought the changes that we saw in the fermented food would happen with the high fiber diet. So the lab that I work in is very pro high fiber. And we didn't see the resounding effects that we saw in the fermented group. And it was interesting because a subset of participants on the high fiber group actually responded and some didn't and became more inflamed. And so what seemed to differentiate them is what their microbiome profile was before they started eating. So I was talking a little bit about microbiome diversity and how fermented foods increase your diversity so that you're more adaptable to perturbations. And for the high fiber diet, the people who had a higher diversity or higher number of microbes in their gut to begin with became much healthier after high fiber diet. People who had low diversity actually became more inflamed. So you can imagine eating high fermented foods to increase that diversity and then following it up with high fiber would be the optimal way to go about it. I think that's pretty exciting research as well and something that we're looking into more in the future. I'm also looking at probiotic and how those change. That's obviously way easier than eating 6 cups of yogurt. And so those results also seem to be more dependent, person by person dependent. The fermented food diet is actually the only study that I've worked on where everyone in the study kind of became healthier, less personalized medicine. And then also looking at like plant-based meat and animal-based meat and what the differences are there. So, I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's coming up, and I'm really excited to see where it goes from here.
Yeah, that's super exciting. I'm like, wow, this is super exciting. I love reading about like how nutrition affects like your overall health. And so that's super exciting. I think about, oh, there's so many studies that would be super interesting to run. Did you find anything interesting regarding the animal versus plant-based meat?
So that was focused on a molecule, or not a molecule, a metabolite called TMAO. And so TMAO, increased levels of TMAO is reported to be associated with worsening heart problems. And so TMAO is metabolized by microbes. And so that's why it was interesting. And so when people eat animal-based meat, their TMAO goes up and then heart disease goes up. Whereas in animal-based meat, that does not happen. You get ideally the same taste and flavor of meat, but you don't have this metabolite that is causing heart disease. And so that was the basis of the study and our hypothesis, and it was correct. So that's exciting. I think people kind of already know that plant-based meat is healthier than animal-based meat, but that was one way of showing that in a large controlled study. Yeah, I think one of the other things that I'm really interested and excited about in the future and what I'm going to be working on is kind of going more in depth at the mechanism that um, fermented foods have on the body so that we can amplify it. Um, 6 cups of yogurt is, I think, a little bit too much for people to be implementing on their daily life. So you can imagine if we know what part of the fermented food is causing the improved health effects, we can increase it. And so you could only have one or two fermented food products a day and have the same effects. And so that's what I'm super interested in. And I'm kind of working towards engineering healthier fermented foods.
Hmm, that's really cool. In terms of, yeah, I think somebody trying to eat however many cups of probiotics a day could be really hard. What are your thoughts on like probiotic pills? Like they have, probiotic pills that come refrigerated or whatnot, and they sell at like Whole Foods or like kind of a higher tier, like health stores would have these like special probiotics that are like however many millions per pill, and they're supposed to be really good. And I had that recommended to me before by a gynecologist who's like, "Oh, this will be really good for your body's bacteria." And I was like, "Oh, okay, interesting." I mean, I don't know if I noticed a significant difference because I think of my own body as like, "Oh, this is like kind of a scientific experiment. I'm going to try taking these pills." And they were actually quite pricey. And I was like, I'm going to give it a try. I felt good, but I couldn't tell because there's obviously so many other variables in my everyday life that could have affected it. I think I did feel a little bit better, but I was like, do I really want to spend this much money on like a really tiny little container with a few pills? I was like, I don't know. I kind of fell off of that. I tried it once and I was like, oh, this is like really, this is like a really fancy, like little glass bottle. It's just like a nice experience, but I wasn't entirely sure if I felt like a major change. And I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on probiotic pills?
Yeah. Well, probiotics became very hot, like I forget how many years ago, maybe like 8 or so years ago, and then the markets exploded, and there's not good regulation, and so it's difficult because probiotics are made extremely differently, and quality is extremely variable between brands. And so there are a couple of brands that are trying really hard to make sure that the exact strains are in there, and those are vetted and grounded in scientific research that are associated with healthier outcomes. And so I want to impress upon how correlation is very different from causation. And so a lot of microbiome research is looking at, okay, these people that are healthy have these microbes in their gut. These people that are unhealthy have these microbes in their gut. So let's say that if we gave the people that are the microbes from the healthy people and the people that are not healthy, they will also become healthier. That's the idea behind correlation. And that is not grounded in like if the actual mechanism is there. And so you can imagine that healthy people have a different lifestyle than unhealthy people, whether because they're able to do things outside or eat different things. And so their microbiome is going to be different by virtue of a different lifestyle. That doesn't necessarily mean that their microbes are making them healthier. And so that's one big caveat with probiotics is they have not been shown to causally change a person's health like fermented foods have, like the study that I just described. Um, the one instance in which probiotics have actually been shown to be healthy in like a controlled study is in infants. And I think that's because infants have a very non-complex microbiome. They basically don't have anything. And so when you give them a probiotic, that's going to make a big change. Whereas in adults, we have already a really complex community in there. And so taking one pill is going to not have nearly the effects as a blank slate of an infant. And so that's why fermented foods, higher density, and also you're eating a lot more, and they come with all of the complex carbohydrates and whatnot in the food itself. So disentangling the microbes that are living in the food and the food matrix, the proteins and carbohydrates that come with it, definitely a source of study that's going on now. And so I think probiotics kind of jumped the gun. They're like, okay, these are the microbes that are associated with health. We're going to assume that that's the only thing that's important. And so caution in, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a boutique thing now. They're expensive. There hasn't been really good data showing that they improve health. The study that I'm working on now showed that it's similar to the fiber. Some people responded to them, some people didn't, and that response was dependent on the diet that they ate. So I think if you're going to take a probiotic, definitely do your research on which ones have been vetted and have good quality strains in it, that they're, have structures in place that you know what you're putting in your body, and it's not just kind of loosey goosey. And then on top of that, it's increasingly clear that you need to have a healthy diet and lifestyle on top of that in order to see the effects. They might push it over the threshold, but I think, you can't just take a pill and hope everything goes away. But
Yeah, definitely. I think yeah, I think food is a good way to do it because, people have been successful by eating food as, a way to kind of cure or help solve a bunch of ailments for a really, 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 really long time. And so like this technology is pretty new, but I was like, give it a try. And I don't remember which brand I picked, but I did go with one that from all of my research and asking around and talking to like some other doctors that I know, this is like a good brand. And I didn't notice too big of a difference.
I mean,
So
I've talked to some people that take probiotics and they became less lactose intolerant, so they're able to eat some more cheese. So, um, pretty anecdotal. I mean, it's another thing of just like do what works for you.
mhm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think even I don't know enough about lactose intolerance, but I'm definitely lactose intolerant to an extent. And I think some people say like if you continue to eat like yogurt very frequently, it'll potentially help. I'm not even sure about that one.
Yeah, I mean, there are microbes that break down lactose, and so if you seed them in your gut, then they'll break down the lactose when you consume it. Um, that might be hard to do, but I theoretically it makes sense. You could do it.
Yeah. So besides fermented foods, what other hobbies do you have? You run a company. Are you able to share a little bit about what your company does?
Yeah, sure. So I just started a company. We're about a year old now. Focused on how I was talking about the microbiome and how it affects the immune system in particular. So we're kind of trying to break down the products or the chemicals that microbes produce and amplify them in their effects in the body. So you can imagine, humans, animals have been evolving with microbes in our body, on our skin for millions of years. They have all the knobs and dials on our physiology, and we understand basically none of it. So if we can, you know, kind of peek behind the curtain and see how our immune system is responding to all of these chemicals that a lot of times we don't even know what the annotation is. We don't know what they are. If we can isolate those and make them drugs, the chances of them being therapeutics is a lot higher than something you can imagine would be from the middle of the ocean or the soil or something like that. Like a lot of drugs that are naturally produced come from places that are very different from the human body, like oceanic vents and things like that. And so those chemicals that microbes produce have a much higher chance of being toxic to us. But the microbes in our body, those chemicals are already circulating every day. And so toxicity is much lower. Basically, what we need to understand is like which ones are important so that we can amplify the signal in people that have chronic inflammation, IBD, eczema, all of these things where it's just something is a little bit, the brake is on or the gas pedal is too high. And so if we can understand that interplay between them, we'll be able to understand how human physiology works a lot better. So the company that I started is systematically looking at the chemicals that microbes produce to make them into drugs.
Cool. Wow, that's awesome. And do you have any other things that you want to share that you enjoy doing? I know you have like a million talents and you're like one of the most talented people I know.
Thanks, Irene. um, I like being outside. I like biking. Like writing. That was something that I picked up during quarantine, spending a lot of time inside. So I started writing a lot. That's a big hobby. Just appreciate art in general. Doing anything that's different from work so I can do that mental cross training is really important, I find, to stay creative and think about things from a bird's eye point of view. And so I don't get lost, the trees for the forest. I really try to be a strategist as opposed to a tactician. So um, trying to see how things connect with each other is my main goal. And so being broad in the hobbies that I pursue and work that I pursue, that's kind of the main component, threading it all together.
Cool. Yeah, wrapping up, are there any last things that you want to share? And it could be about fermented foods, it could be about really anything.
Um, I don't think so. I mean, the TLDR is pretty simple. Eat your fermented foods. Um, I have the paper that I was talking about. It's in the last stages of revision, and hopefully getting published soon in Cell. You can find it if you Google my name. I'm the only Hannah Wastyk that comes up, and you can find my publications there.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on the show today. It was really great to have you, and hopefully I'll get you on in the future to talk about some of your art or some of your writing. You're like super talented. Can't wait to have you on again. But thanks again for coming on, and we're going to sign off as always. Final deep breath in together. Deep breath out. Have a good rest of your day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.